The complicated world of international sports continues, especially with this story that I think is very important for us here on the Sports Cubicle to talk about. And of course, there's nobody better to talk about it with than Paul Chivari and here myself, Mike Mercado. You know, I'm not the biggest of soccer fans, and Paulie is. He covers the sport. He watches the sport like a blanket. And this story, when it hits the news, was, you would think, would be the biggest story, but in the subject matter, does it compare to the global ramifications of how we got to this point? So, as we all knew, in May 28th, the final of the 2022 European Soccer Club Championship was set to be held in St. Petersburg. Well, that was the case until Thursday, because UEFA, the European soccer governing body, said that the Championship League final, the biggest match in European club soccer, will not be played in St. Petersburg, Russia. UEFA stripped Russia of the game set for the May 28th date, was to be played in a stadium financed by the Russian energy giant Gazprom, one of the UEFA's major sponsors. So, of course, here on WCPT 820, we are covering everything that's happening on the Ukraine and Russian border. But this is where politics, where geopolitical issues hit the sports world. And Paulie, when you heard the story, when you saw what happened with the Russian army going and invading the border of Ukraine, and what President Biden is saying about the sanctions, and now seeing this from the biggest soccer entity in the world, your thoughts on this entire situation?
Well, it's amazing to see how swiftly UEFA acted, because I think we've seen examples in, other sports where, there's kind of a waffling around and kind of a hand wringing, because of all the money involved. You mentioned Gazprom. They are a huge sponsor of the Champions League. And, to have UEFA just swiftly take it away from St. Petersburg shows that they're pretty serious about this, and that they're not going to coddle Russia when Russia's committing some serious actions here. So I applaud UEFA by not letting money make decisions for them. They're standing their ground. They're being a morality based decision here, because we don't see that from the IOC or FIFA. So I think that's something that needs to be acknowledged. I also want to make note too, I don't cover the sport like a blanket. I cover Liverpool like a blanket, but because of my love for Liverpool soccer and of course United States men's soccer, I've opened up kind of a world of soccer that I really appreciate. And so I do love covering the sport. And I think out of us here at the Sports Cubicle, I'm easily the most soccer fluent out of all of us. But this is a big deal. The Champions League is a big deal. And it's like, I know, Mike, you don't really care about it, but it's kind of like their Super Bowl. Yeah. I mean, when it comes down to the two clubs, it's a very big deal, when it comes into late May. And it's usually a really exciting game, one that Liverpool won about 2 or 3 years ago. And as we're talking, they're still, in the running right now as they're in the round of 16, working their way down to get to that final in May. I haven't heard anything about where they're going to hold the new final, and I'm sure they haven't made an announcement yet, on Thursday. But I'm wondering what that means now. Having to plan something like that in 3 months is kind of a big ordeal. So I'm curious to see which stadium's going to step up. Because I think if I remember from 2020, the season was delayed because of the pandemic, and then they played without a crowd. And then last year they played it, and I'm trying to remember where they had it last year, but I think it was, at least a partial crowd, or, there's some sort of COVID restrictions. But as far as I know, unless anything pops up in the next few months, this is probably going to be the first full capacity match since 2019 when Liverpool defeated Tottenham in Madrid. So, I know when the pandemic happened, Lisbon, Portugal stepped up and hosted, like a bubble, essentially. I don't know if that's like a go-to for UEFA, or if there's another stadium somewhere else, maybe even more towards Western Europe, to try and stay away from any potential military conflict that might have gotten out of hand 3 months from now. So it's a really curious story. And it's really neat to see a governing body in sport just make a swift moral decision instead of letting money dictate it.
Yeah, and that's where this all comes down to is money and optics. And that's in the most cynical way of why it's important for these countries to host these events. It's why countries spend so much money on getting or bribing the IOC or FIFA. It's because this brings up Q ratings. Every single time a Russian wins a gold medal or a Chinese athlete wins a gold medal, the ratings of the politicians go quote unquote through the roof, well, because they're the ones dictating who is happy about them or not. But that is what they use this for. It's for propaganda. It's the same reason when the WWE goes to Saudi Arabia, they're basically doing a tourism guide to how to enjoy life in Saudi and a traveler's guide of why you should come there. This is all these things are. And that's why for UEFA to do something like this will hurt the pockets of Russia and the domino effect that we will see, where we will see an emergency meeting of the top board members of UEFA will be Friday. So by the time we hit next week, we might have an idea of who will be hosting this championship game. And I think for a lot of people, you just said it, it's like the Super Bowl being moved from the United States somewhere else. There is an entire fan base. It is the most popular sport in the world. And we are seeing what happens when the politics of the world hit the politics of sports and where that crossing line comes of money. And I think you mentioned it. This is a sport where there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money that gets transferred from these clubs, from these associations. So I think you mentioned it, how neat it is, how wonderful it is to see them act so fast. But before we kind of move on from the subject and we keep an eye on everything that develops from it, it is a big shock that they were willing to do this. I mean, maybe it goes to show that they have another backer somewhere, that they've been preparing for this type of moment. But I think for a soccer entity to say, you know what, we're out of this. We're not playing this game. I mean, for American fans, how surprising is it that they actually did it? Not only did it, but did it this fast.
I think it helps that it's a few months away. You know, if this would have been a couple weeks beforehand, they might have had to delay the match. You know, I think, you know, the intention is to still have it played on May 28th. Whereas I think, you know, if this was a few weeks before, you know, then you got to find a venue that's open. You got to plan security, you know, just everything that surrounds the tournament. So I think it gives them enough time where they can scramble and find a new venue and figure out the logistics of it. But the timing worked out in their favor that Vladimir Putin decided now to do what he was doing instead of waiting a few weeks away. And this is kind of a tangent here, but I was thinking, you know, how does the Olympics factor into this? That, you know, I'm wondering if Vladimir Putin was waiting for the closing ceremonies in China to do what he was going to do. You know, because think of that awkwardness of initiating essentially warfare in the middle of the Olympic Games. You know, how the awkwardness of Ukrainian and ROC athletes competing against each other while this was going on. And you really didn't hear much about that during the games. But that was something that was in the back of my mind watching the Winter Olympics over the last few weeks was, well, gosh, this dude hasn't done his thing in the middle of the Winter Olympics. He must be waiting for the closing ceremonies. Well, sure enough, here we are a week after the closing ceremonies. And now that's when most of the conflict has been initiated.
And that's the thing, right? All these moves are made for a specific reason. And we're just seeing how it's being affected now by everything. And it's something that I was interested in locally, here, nationally, how if a war breaks out between Russia, Ukraine, and how the United States intervenes. We've heard what the president has had to say. We're going to see how it develops over the next few days. But how war changes sports, how war makes certain sporting events even more important. From Jesse Owens all the way to this point right here in the Beijing Olympics, like we've seen where sports and the platform and the arena in which you're competing in all really do determine the history, the story, and kind of think about the miracle, the movie, like, you know, the USA and the USSR, like that idea of like how important the Miracle on Ice is compared to some other sporting events, compared to the 85 Bears. Like these things matter and they do go down in the history books and they affect the way people look at certain reasons. So I guess, Paulie, as we wrap this up here on the Sports Cubicle, it's Devin Tingle, Paul Chivari, Dan Marver, and myself, Mike Mercado, trying to make some sense in this crazy world, and UEFA taking away the Championships League's finals from St. Petersburg. Your final thoughts, this craziness. What are you expecting? What are you feeling? How do you think this all breaks down over the next few days? And if you had to take a wild guess, do you think that they find a safe spot, like let's say Madrid, something they've done before? How do you think this all plays out?
I mean, I'm not an expert on, foreign relations and international conflict, so I don't know how this Russia-Ukraine thing is going to play out. But as far from a sporting aspect of it, I'm wondering if FIFA or UEFA is going to put on sanctions on Russian clubs from further participation in Champions League events. I think as it stands right now, Russia's top soccer league gets maybe one or two bids into the UEFA Champions League tournament, whether it's a play in or an automatic qualification. And there are there's some good clubs in Moscow that have tended to make it at least round robin play, sometimes round of 16 play. I'm wondering if there's further conflict or certain human rights violations or Geneva Convention violations, what have you, what sort of, if any, sanctions will be placed on Russian clubs from participation in Europe.
It's going to be fascinating. We want you to keep it tuned in to your WCPT and, of course, the Heartland Signal, who do amazing work, and they will be covering it. It is Santita Jackson, Stephanie Miller, Tom Hartman, and, of course, Joan Esposito, Patty Vasquez. It is a stacked lineup that will keep you up to date and give you the national and local perspective. And we want to know how you guys feel about this. I hope that, in me personally, like Paul said, we're not experts here. We're big dummies who enjoy watching sports and talking about it with our friends and the whole community here on the Sports Cubicle. All I know is that I hope that the people of in Ukraine and the civilians in Russia and the soldiers who don't get to make these decisions, that they're all safe, because we know these are decisions that are made by people in boardrooms and in governments, and it is the people who suffer. And sports are supposed to be our distraction. And what we've learned and what has always been fact is they reflect real life. And this is real life, and we don't hide from it here on the Sports Cubicle. So we want to know your thoughts about the UEFA making a decision to get out of St. Petersburg and how you're feeling about this entire craziness happening at the border of Ukraine and Russia. We're on Twitter at Sports Cubicle TV. I want to thank my amazing co-host, Paul Chivari, for having this conversation with us. And, of course, our other amazing co-hosts, Devin Tingle and Dan Marver. I'm Mike Mercado.